This is the American Forces Network, Europe.
It's 6 o'clock in Central Europe. All is go for the launch of Apollo 16 later this hour, and the North Vietnamese criticized the United States for the latest bombing near Hanoi and Haiphong, while claiming the American raids damaged a Soviet ship. AFN News from the wires of the AP and UPI. Good evening, this is Paul Macco in Frankfurt. The countdown for the launch of Apollo 16 is proceeding on schedule at Cape Kennedy, with forecasters predicting excellent conditions for the liftoff. Astronauts John Young, Thomas Mattingly, and Charles Duke were awakened about 5 hours ago and underwent their final medical examination. Doctors say all three astronauts are in good health for America's next attempt to put men on the moon. AFN's live coverage of the launch of Apollo 16 is scheduled to begin at 6:45.
This is a live special report from ABC Radio News. I'm Bill Larson with Merrill Muller at Cape Kennedy in Florida. This is liftoff day for Apollo 16. Dominating the scene here, the familiar towering shape of the Saturn V rocket on pad 39A. Atop the rocket, in the command module, astronauts John Young, Charles Duke, and Ken Mattingly. Red Muller, where do we stand in the count?
Bill, we're at T-minus 8 minutes and 36 seconds and counting for the Apollo 16 launch. A bulky part and one automatic pilot aboard the giant Saturn rocket is being ignored. Others are available if needed. The launch complex is straight ahead of us here in the bright summer weather of Cape Kennedy. Conditions are ideal for the 6th American effort to explore the moon. The mission of astronauts Young, Mattingly, and Duke is to determine whether the mountains of the moon are of volcanic origin and if they might have formed at about the same time as the distant planet Mars. This Moon-Mars relationship is new. Young and Duke are scheduled to spend a record 73 hours with moonship Orion on the southeast corner of the moon. Command ship Casper will bring them back to the Pacific Ocean next April 28th after another 12-day space flight crammed with scientific experiments. One of these experiments, for the first time, makes the moon a manned astronomical observatory. Young and Duke will make studies of the 90% of space that man has never seen, if all goes well with Apollo 16. Bill?
The commander of Apollo 16, John Young, 41, is a Navy captain, a veteran in space, 2 flights in the Gemini program, and as command ship pilot when Apollo 10 orbited the moon in 1969. Young is from Orlando, Florida. Charles Duke will land on the moon with Young. Duke is 36, a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. This is his first space flight, but he was closely involved with the first moon landing as capsule communicator in Houston when Neil Armstrong first stepped on the moon. Duke was born in Charlotte, North Carolina. Ken Mattingly will stay in the command ship. Mattingly has also going on his first space flight. This is live coverage of the launch of Apollo 16. Bill Larson along with Red Muller at Cape Kennedy, Florida. It's T-minus about 5 minutes and 48 seconds and counting toward the liftoff of Apollo 16. Red?
We've just had the final status checks. They're running a little ahead in their actual countdown plan. We've had the final status checks of the 2 spaceships, Casper, the command ship, and Orion, the moon lander, and the pilots report that both spaceships are ready for flight, and they're in now to the final preparations for the automatic sequence firing. The rocket, of course, is not touched off by a man, but it is touched off by a computer count. Bill?
Deke Slayton happened to mention that he's in charge of crew training a little earlier, that they had their usual steak and eggs breakfast this morning, but Deke says it wasn't too good because it was kind of a TV dinner type thing. And now let's join Launch Control and Chuck Collins, Ed, here at Cape Kennedy.
This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control. We're now passing the 6-minute mark in the countdown. Emergency detection system has now been placed in the launch mode. Houston Flight has also indicated that they are go for the automatic sequencer. At the T-minus 3 minutes 7 second mark, the launch will go on the automatic sequencer, and from that point on, the launch will be automatically handled by the sequencer. Coming up on the T-minus 5 minute and 30 second mark, at that time we'll be standing by for a go to launch from Mission Director Chet Lee. Mission Director verifies go for launch. Mission Director Chet Lee from Houston verifies go for launch. All elements now reporting into Test Supervisor Gordon Turner that they are go for launch. Now T-minus 5 minutes, 13 seconds and counting. This is Kennedy Launch Control.
I think while we've got a chance, we'll try to identify some voices for you here. That's Chuck Hollinshead. This is his second Apollo launch. He has replaced Jack King here at the Cape Kennedy News Center for NASA. Jack King's gone to Houston, where he now runs things over there. The voices you will be hearing out of Houston, talking to the astronauts in space, will be Capcom Gordon Fullerton, another astronaut, who will be the first up this morning, and he will be relieved a little later by Stuart Brusa, who is one of the backup crew. And we will be calling in from time to time from Houston the voice of John McLeish. Here is Chuck Hollinshead.
Number 9 is now swinging back to the full retract position. The astronaut crew aboard are making their final switch checks, reading off these final positions, preparation for launch. As we approach the final minutes here, we'll go into a relatively silent period as far as reporting goes. The launch team indicates that they will have only negative reporting. If there's a problem only, will they come up on the air at this time. Now, T-minus 4 minutes, 3 seconds and counting. This is Kennedy Launch Control.
That was, again, of course, Chuck Hollinshead, and negative reporting is the rule throughout this flight. My colleague Bill Larson has gone to our observatory here at Cape Kennedy, where he gets a much better view of the launch operation and the actual liftoff. Bill?
And the picture of the Saturn V rocket, perfect.
Well, Donnelly just called the 3 astronauts and said that the Apollo 16 launch team wishes them good luck and Godspeed. They all replied, thank you, and we're now have a quiet circuit as they switch over to the Astrocom circuit. We're now T-minus 3 minutes, 24 seconds and counting. We're approaching the time when the countdown goes on the terminal sequencer. The sequencer commands a variety of functions, all which must occur in the proper sequence for the count to continue. Also here in the control center, the people will continue to monitor what are called the red line values to ensure that everything is go for launch. The instrument unit light, panel light now on the status board indicates instrument unit ready, spacecraft ready, emergency detection system ready. We've passed the 2 minute 50-second mark, and we're now on the terminal sequencer. The terminal sequencer has started. This terminal sequencer will pressurize the fuel tanks. These fuel tanks are pressurized to ensure that as the fuels deplete, they are forced down to assure an even flow into the engine. Fuel tanks are now being pressurized. The S4B, or third stage liquid oxygen tank, has just been pressurized, and the second stage liquid oxygen tank has been pressurized.
Beach area is packed.
We move down through the count at the T-minus 17-second mark. We'll get a release of the guidance system in the instrument unit.
Chuck Hollinshead, launch control.
Also handled by the automatic sequencer will be the release of swing arms number 1 and number 2. The ignition of the Saturn V 5 engines, the first stage 5 engines, will take place at 8.9 seconds in the countdown. 8.9 seconds. All right, the engines will, or the vehicle will then be held down until we build up to 7.7 million pounds of thrust. At the T-minus 3 minute mark, tape recorders on board the spacecraft were turned on. These recorders record both voice and data.
All eyes on the rocket.
Now to full internal cooling. The cooling load has been shared with a ground cooling. T-minus 90 seconds and counting. T-minus 90 seconds and counting. At T-minus 1 minute 15 seconds, the spacecraft batteries will be turned on for launch. These batteries will give an additional power source to the spacecraft, as well as be acting as a backup for the fuel cells. The third stage liquid hydrogen tanks now pressurized. All third stage tanks pressurized. Second stage tanks also pressurized. T-minus 1 minute. T-minus 1 minute and counting. Now moving into the final minute of the count. We'll be standing by for the switch over to internal power. Switch over taking place at this time, going on internal power. T-minus 45 seconds and counting. Guidance aligned, just announced by John Young. That will be the last action taken by the crew aboard the spacecraft. T-minus 35 and counting. Countdown continuing to go well. T-minus 30. T-minus 25, 24, 23, 22, 21, 20, 19, 18, 17. Guidance release. 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9. We have ignition sequence start. The engine's
Fire on the tail. And there it goes, the huge Saturn V rocket carrying astronauts outstandingly, killing on their trip to the moon. Now beginning to clear the launch tower here at Cape Kennedy, climbing with 7.7 million pounds of thrust, climbing gradually, agonizingly into the air. And gradually now we can hear this staccato, this pulsating effect that always comes from the Saturn V rocket as it moves on its journey toward the moon. Climbing slowly, everyone here at the plant site, watching it and almost every muscle straining to give a little added muscle to this Saturn V, boosting it on its way into Earth orbit. Some 90 nautical miles, Earth orbit before going out of the moon. Going briefly now through one small puff of cloud, then climbing out again. This huge, tremendous yellow-orange glare of flame coming from the base of this Saturn V rocket as it moves slowly into this clear blue Florida sky. Absolutely a beautiful sight. You can feel that staccato, that rumbling, that pulsating effect now as it climbs higher and higher. It's a sight once seen, never forgotten.
That call up from Capcom Gordon Fuller.
Never quite the same as we've seen it before.
Water landing. Mark 1 minute 12 seconds coming up on period of maximum aerodynamic pressure on the vehicle.
It should be about 8 miles high now, about 1,100 miles an hour.
2 seconds. 6 nautical miles in altitude, looking good. Mark 1 minute 30 seconds. 8 nautical miles in altitude.
We're listening to John McLeish, who is repeating what Gordon Fullerton and Commander John Duke are talking about. Everything is perfect aboard the spaceship as it climbs out. Everything perfect. That's the report from the flight crew.
1.5 nautical miles in altitude. Young Duke maddeningly moving out to the outer traces of the Earth's atmosphere.
And that Saturn...
Mode 1 Charlie. Roger, we're Mark 1 Charlie.
Saturn V left its own cloud up there.
Mark 2 minutes 3 seconds. The status check and mission control by Flight Director Gene Krantz. A go, no go for staging.
A lot of flame still coming from the first stage of the Saturn V rocket as we see it climbing higher and higher and higher.
On center engine shutdown.
Center engine is...
Put your inboard, your go for staging.
And being
Center
go for
engine
separation.
shutdown on time.
Center engine shutdown. We should see separation, hopefully.
2 minutes 28 seconds. 26 nautical miles in altitude. 32 nautical miles downrange.
Watching for that puff of smoke, that
2
contrail.
minutes 35 seconds.
Be in just a
2
few
minutes
seconds.
40 seconds coming up on staging.
There it is.
There it is. Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful as the second stage of the Saturn V ignited. Burst of flame. Giving it that extra push needed to carry it on
2 minutes 53 seconds.
toward its 90 nautical miles orbit.
Staging. Young Duke maddeningly now riding on 5 good second stage engines.
On the S2.
Absolutely
3 minutes 2 seconds. The giant first
All
stage
engines
pulling away
perfect
now.
up there on the second stage, and we are just watching a disappearing white dot in a deep blue sky, way up there this time.
like some pinpoint up there, Ed. A pinpoint of white or silver against the blue, and almost completely gone now out of sight.
Roger, and we confirm your skirt's up, your mode 2 now. Let's go live, clear the ground.
3 minutes 28 seconds.
That Roger mode 2 was
on
John
time.
Young,
It's surveillance rule
commander of
required.
Apollo 16. Climbing out very steadily.
Steering has converged. CMC is go. Roger.
That's Young on the rudder.
3 minutes 45 seconds.
This is John McLeish.
Apollo 16 now 62 nautical miles in altitude, 135 nautical miles downrange. Apollo 16 now 33 feet shorter and 9,000 pounds lighter. Unencumbered now for its mission in space.
If that doesn't mean much, that means
Houston, 4 minutes, everything looks great down here.
Apollo 16 now weighs in at 745 tons, doing about 5,285 miles an hour. That's quite a machine, Bill.
And it's gulping fuel at the rate of about 3,000
nautical miles downrange. Velocity now reading 10,600 feet per second.
That's McLeish's voice out of Houston with the figures for us. And Fullerton has been just giving the parameters to Young.
4 minutes, 30 seconds in mission control. Trajectory data driving right down the middle of our plot boards as expected. Right now, flight path data is go.
Course and altitude exactly as planned. Young has been saying very little, Bill. He's just acknowledging and cutting out.
4 minutes, 45 seconds, 76 nautical miles in altitude, 220 nautical miles downrange.
That was anticipated, however. John Young was not expected to talk too much, nor was Ken Mattingly.
I'm trying to read the clock. We're 5 minutes into the flight plan here, and we should be halfway to Bermuda. We should be halfway to Bermuda and getting
Mark,
up
5 minutes, 10 seconds.
altitude.
Still good performance on all 5 second stage engines.
As with the first stage, the
Second stage shutdown predicted at 9 minutes, 19 seconds.
16 Houston, times are nominal. Level sets of the 8+37 and cut off at 9er plus 1-9er.
That second stage shutdown will come just west of Bermuda, and
Mark, 5
between
minutes, 40 seconds. Another status check in mission control by Flight Director Gene Krantz. His
and
console
between
is coming up
the
all greens. Looking good at this
operational
time.
ship Opportune, which is lying to the east of us here at Cape Kennedy and Bermuda.
4B to COI capability.
And the astronauts hope to take Apollo 16 into a 106-mile orbit above the Earth.
6 minutes with Captain Gordon Fullerton reporting that 16 capable of
Just
reaching
east of Bermuda and
a good third
between
stage.
Bermuda and the tracking ship Vanguard, which is in the middle of the Atlantic.
Apollo 16, 88 nautical miles in altitude, 380 nautical miles downrange.
In nautical miles, for McLeish's readings that we're feeding you from Houston, he is live to us, and also he is not live to the spaceship, if you wonder. He's live to us so that we have guidance on it, and to you. The nautical miles will read 96 when they reach orbit.
14,880 feet per second. Altitude 90 nautical miles for Apollo 16. Downrange distance 440 nautical miles.
They're almost there.
Stand by for S4B to orbit. Mark, you have it now. Roger.
S4B, of course, the third stage of the rocket
6
system.
minutes, 50 seconds.
Delta 40. Roger, Charlie.
should have the
Young Duke Mattingly now told that they can reach orbit if given a good third stage. Mark, 7 minutes, 91 nautical miles in altitude, 496 nautical miles downrange.
We should get center engine cutoff on that second stage very shortly.
And of course, they're getting the burn they want out of the second stage.
Mark, 7 minutes, 15 seconds, 16 flying almost parallel over the ocean now with the young crew in a pitched down position. Really moving out now for downrange distance. We show Apollo 16 551 nautical miles downrange. Velocity now reading 17,527 feet per second.
I don't think John means that exactly as he said it. Pitched down would mean they'd be flying on their heads. And they are not. They're actually still climbing
Coming
out.
up on center engine shutdown.
Roger, inboard.
They are on their backs, though.
Center engine shut down on time. 7 minutes, 50 seconds. 92 nautical miles in altitude, 620 nautical miles downrange.
Now, the job of the third stage, the S4B, is to just get them another 4 miles of altitude and a lot of speed.
Still showing stable thrust on the other 4 engines. They've got about a minute to go in burn time remaining.
That's the outboard engines on the
16
second
at 8
stage.
minutes, looking good here.
They will be doing only about 14,500 miles an hour when the second stage shuts down. They need about 17,500 to make sure they've got the necessary speed.
Mark, 8 minutes, 25 seconds.
That'll be the job of the
Houston, we saw the PU ship. Thrust looks good, and your go for staging. Roger.
We will hear the report from staging from
8
Young.
minutes, 35 seconds. Apollo 16 now 93 nautical miles in altitude, 756 nautical miles downrange.
Almost on time now. Roger.
They're over Bermuda.
That terse response from Apollo 16 Commander John Young. We're at 8 minutes 52 seconds. Apollo 16 now 807 nautical miles downrange, 92 nautical miles in altitude.
Should have
Velocity now reading 21,642 feet per second.
separation in about 15 seconds. The S4B will then ignite.
Seconds exactly, Bill. You watch it and you grab it. Young should report engine shutdown first, I believe.
Stand by for mode 4 capability. Mark, you have mode 4 now.
Should hit it now.
Okay, there was S2 shutdown.
Roger.
And we have S4B ignition.
Just the way we called it. Mode 4 is an emergency rescue mode. It would mean they'd land in Africa. We can skip it.
The young crew has used up 2/3 of their Saturn stages on the way to orbit. We see good performance on the third stage, the S4B. That Mode 4 report says Apollo 16 can achieve orbit on spacecraft power only. 9 minutes 50 seconds. Apollo 16, 93 nautical miles in altitude, 1,011 nautical miles downrange. Velocity now reading at 23,654 feet per second.
They're getting a little more speed a little earlier than they expected. The rocket performance here has been magnificent today. And by the way, they're at 188 tons. They're going to put a record weight into Earth orbit. We'll see how it works out when they get there.
Mark, 10 minutes 18 seconds. The status check and mission control for orbit.
Should have that cutoff of the S4B in about 30 seconds or less.
Apollo 16 Houston, your go for orbit. Predicted cutoff 11 plus 49er.
Roger, 1149.
They are running 2 seconds ahead of their flight plan. That's how much better
Mark, 10 minutes 40
performance has been.
seconds. Predicted time of shutdown 11 minutes 49 seconds. Apollo 16 now 93 nautical miles in altitude, 1,192 nautical miles downrange.
What they call a storybook flight so far. As everyone has been.
Mark, 11 minutes, showing a build-up in velocity now reading 24,621 feet per second and accelerating.
They've got all the speed they need
Mark,
right
11
now.
minutes, 10 seconds.
They're there safely. That gives
Velocity now reading 24,887 feet per second.
That's over 16,000 miles an hour, and boosting that with the Earth kick from Earth rotation
for insertion into orbit.
You get the other 17,000, and they're just about where they want to be.
I'd like to get that final confirmation of orbit very shortly. And that's what we're waiting for at a ground communication.
Mark, 11 minutes 40 seconds. Apollo 16 now 1,400 nautical miles downrange.
Which is out over the Atlantic.
Right on.
Right on, says Young. And they're at 154.5 tons, which is a record weight for
That was
flying to
shut down,
orbit
right on the money.
and into orbit. They will also be taking a record weight out to the moon. They'll weigh 72 tons when they start that journey later today.
We won't get the final figures on the exact orbit for quite some time until after the spaceship has passed over a few of the tracking stations. But from the looks of it, it should be right on the money.
It certainly was a beautiful sight.
Mark, 12 minutes 25 seconds.
Houston, the range safety system is safe. The orbit is go.
That's it.
Roger,
That's
boy,
orbit
it's just
information.
beautiful up here. Looking out the window, it's just really fantastic. And the thing worked like a champ.
Sure did. Hey, we copy now 62, and your
That was
orbit.
Young and Fullerton exclaiming about the fact that, as Young put it,
12 minutes 54 seconds.
that thing worked like a gem.
Report from orbit was from spacecraft commander John Young.
The situation with the astronauts safely on their way toward the moon in our coverage of the flight of Apollo 16 from ABC Radio News.
You've been listening to live coverage of the launch of Apollo 16 from Cape Kennedy. AFN's next coverage of the Apollo 16 mission is scheduled for Wednesday evening at 10 minutes before 10 o'clock when the craft goes into lunar orbit. Of course, if any problems should develop during the mission, AFN will switch to live coverage as soon as it's made available to us by AFRTS in Washington. It's 8 o'clock in Central Europe. The U.S. command confirms that American warplanes have hit both Haiphong and Hanoi in the latest bombing raids, and the Apollo 16 is on a perfect course for the moon.
AFN News from the wires of the AP and UPI.
Good evening. This is Paul Macco in Frankfurt. Officials at Cape Kennedy say the Apollo 16 moonship is operating perfectly on the first leg of its trip to the lunar surface. The giant Saturn V rocket lifted the Apollo 16 from Earth about 5 minutes before 7 o'clock Central European time. A technical problem in the controls unit of the Saturn V was solved just moments before the blastoff. However, that problem did not force a hold in the countdown. Apollo 16 is scheduled to enter lunar orbit Wednesday night, and astronauts John Young and Charles Duke will land on the moon on Thursday.
It's 7 o'clock in Central Europe. A problem with the Apollo 16 lunar lander endangers moon landing plans, but not the astronauts themselves. Diplomatic channels are clogged with comment on U.S. bombing of North Vietnam. Domestic reaction is predictable so far, and 3 more deaths in Northern Ireland.
The 7 o'clock report, a comprehensive summary of world news and sports developments compiled from the wires of the AP and UPI, with reports from the major American networks.
Good morning, this is Milt Fullerton in Frankfurt. A problem has developed with the Apollo 16 moonship. There's been talk of possibly canceling a planned Thursday moon landing because of mysterious peeling of the lunar module's outer skin. But there's been no definite word on whether the landing is on or off. The problem was noticed first by astronaut Charles Duke, who notified ground controllers about particles he saw streaming from the lunar landing module. He and John Young then entered the module 24 hours earlier than planned, and they found the thin aluminum outer coating peeling away. Duke described it as something close to shredded wheat. Mission Control expressed concern that a jet tank might be leaking and causing the heat protection blanket to peel. They emphasized that this is not the actual wall of the lander that's shredding, only a paint-like thin coat of aluminum designed to protect the fuel tanks from heat. Nonetheless, it could mean the end of plans to land the Apollo 16 astronauts on the moon, though they themselves are in no danger. The flight plan is set up in such a way that should a lunar landing be scrapped for any reason, the astronauts still could orbit the moon and conduct other experiments before returning home. It should be pointed out that all talk of possible cancellation of the moon landing is coming from newsmen and not from Mission Control. Mission Control has said nothing definite one way or the other on this. The astronauts have returned to their command ship again, and soon will begin an 8-hour rest period. Before they do that, however, they're scheduled to exercise for about a half hour or so. They'll dine on fruit, sausage, cereal, and juice. If the lander problem is solved and all goes according to plan, this next to last moon landing in the U.S. space exploration schedule will begin Thursday, with Young and Duke becoming the 9th and the 10th men to set foot on the lunar surface. They'll be landing in the rugged mountains of the moon for the first time. Some 500,000 persons turned out in the Cape Kennedy area yesterday to view the launch of Apollo 16. Invited guests numbered about 30,000, and they included kings, presidents, and entertainers, among others. Among those in the VIP crowd was Vice President Spiro Agnew. He told members of Mission Control and of the press that Americans still are behind the much-criticized space program, and that he himself has an eye to the future.
Ladies and gentlemen, you make the superb commonplace. This is my 7th occasion to visit the Cape at the time of an Apollo launch, and this was one of the finest because, as Dr. Fletcher said, the facility was so good. I have noticed one change since I've been here, and that is that there's so much coolness in the room. I think you're getting a little bit bored with this thing, aren't you? I know you're not. And I assure you that the people of this country aren't bored, and if you went out in the vicinity of the Cape and looked around today, you'd probably find the biggest crowd with more people enthusiastic about the space program than you'd ever seen before. I want you to know that the administration's interest has not diminished, and as chairman of the Space Council, mine continues to accelerate as I look forward to 17 and to the Skylab launchings to follow. What's going to come after that will depend to a great extent on the continuation of your expertise and the great way you discharge your responsibilities. But you know that the people of this country still have that explorer spirit. They still have that tremendous sense of urgency for the United States to be the leader of the world in this kind of technological advance.
Vice President Spiro Agnew speaking at the Kennedy Space Center yesterday.
Peel away, but America's lunar explorers are journeying toward a landing on the moon, and this is going ahead on schedule. The cause of the strange flaking of the thin aluminum foil and mylar thermal blanket remains unknown. Navy Captain John Young and Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Charles Duke entered the lander one day ahead of schedule last night, turned on its power, and conducted a one-hour inspection. Nothing appears amiss in the lander's systems, and there are no plans to alter the mission.
Halting communist thrust.
It's 4 o'clock Central European Time. Turkey's Prime Minister resigns, apparently under political pressure.
AFN News from the wires of the AP and UPI.
Good afternoon, this is Jan Wood, AFN News reporting. There is no undue concern about a mysterious skin problem that has hit the Apollo 16's lunar lander. The craft's protective coating of aluminum and mylar has been flaking away as it hurts.
It's 6 o'clock in Central Europe. North Vietnam makes a qualified offer to resume secret negotiations. Secretary of State Rogers faces the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on U.S. escalation of the bombing of North Vietnam, and the Apollo 16 spacecraft continues on course to the moon.
The 6 o'clock report, an expanded summary of world developments with Today in Europe, compiled from the wires of the AP and UPI, including reports from the major American networks.
Good evening. I'm David Minot in Frankfurt. The moon landing mission continues on schedule, with the only problem a mysterious flaking of the protective plastic coating on the lunar lander. CBS newsman Steve Young reports from Houston that the flaking problem is being discounted and that it probably will have no effect on the mission.
The Apollo 16 astronauts, John Young, Ken Mattingly, and Charlie Duke, are asleep this morning and scheduled to remain so until nearly noon Eastern Time. So they'll breakfast while officials here at the Manned Spacecraft Center are having lunch. Several scientific experiments are then scheduled, including one which involves the use of an electric current to separate different kinds of molecules. The experiment has been done before and is supposed to demonstrate a practical Apollo application, a spin-off of the program, the preparation of vaccines in the weightlessness of space. It appears this morning that the lunar lander Orion is in proper condition to be set down on the moon Thursday. Normally, that would not be known until Commander Young and LEM pilot Duke crossed through the tunnel into the LEM tonight. But they made an early trip last night because they were concerned about a stream of flecks coming from the LEM. Steve Young, CBS News, Manned Spacecraft Center, Houston.
It's 8 o'clock Central European Time. President Nixon has chosen a new ambassador for West Germany.
AFN News from the wires of the AP UPI.
Good evening. Team crew hurtles onward toward a Thursday landing on the moon. The mission is on course, with nothing apparently amiss, while command control grapples with the mysterious peeling of the coat of the lunar lander Orion.
It's 10 o'clock in Central Europe. Secretary of State William Rogers defends the U.S. bombing of North Vietnam. The Soviet Union protests the damage allegedly caused to 4 Russian ships in Haiphong Harbor by American warplanes. President Nixon announces his choice for the new ambassador to West Germany, and Ford reports it's recalling nearly 400,000 of its 1972 model cars.
The 10 o'clock report, an expanded summary of world developments compiled from the wires of the AP and UPI, with reports from the major American networks and comments.
Good evening, this is Paul Macco reporting from Frankfurt. Say the peeling of the outer coating of the Apollo 16 lunar lander involves a protective paint, and the condition will not affect the mission. Engineers say the flecks of paint from the coating of the moon ship were applied to protect the craft from the sun's angle in the lunar highlands should the craft have to be launched later than expected from the lunar surface. The 3 Apollo 16 astronauts were awakened about 4 hours ago after spending a rather restless night sleeping in space.
It's 7 o'clock in Central Europe. Continued heavy fighting in Vietnam, plus reports of South Vietnamese move into North Vietnam and of an attack on U.S. naval destroyer. Former President Johnson suffers new irregular heartbeat, and Apollo 16 on course, on schedule, on its way to the moon.
The 7 o'clock report, an expanded summary of world developments compiled from the wires of the AP and UPI, with reports from the major American networks, sports, and stock market activity.
Good morning, this is Milt Fullerton in Frankfurt. The Apollo 16 astronauts, having begun the downhill half of their journey to the moon, have fired one of their rockets for 2 seconds. The aim was to speed up the spacecraft by about 8.5 miles an hour, in order to ensure that it arrives in lunar orbit tomorrow at the precise time scheduled. The spacemen have checked out their lunar landing module again, both to see if there are any new developments in a paint flaking problem discovered earlier, and also to check out other systems to be used in the landing on the moon Thursday. The flaking continues to spread, but Steve Young of CBS News says that so long as the landing occurs on schedule, there should be no concern about the loss of the lunar module's outer skin.
Space officials today said despite the flaking of a silicon coating on some outer surfaces of the LEM, Thursday's moon landing will go ahead as scheduled. The coating had been put on to protect the lunar lander from higher temperatures than actually will be encountered during the 73-hour stay on the surface of the moon. It would have been a problem if launch had been delayed and the spacecraft arrived with the sun higher above the moon's horizon and thus producing hotter surface temperatures. Apollo 16 passed the 100,000 miles from Earth milestone, or as Commander John Young put it, Earth and Moon look to him to be about the same size. So far, Young, Duke, and Mattingly have been a rather taciturn trio, even though the latter two have never been in space before. Steve Young, CBS News, Manned Spacecraft Center, Houston.
It's 12 noon in Central Europe. The U.S. Pacific Fleet Commander reported trying to hush up a naval incident in the Gulf of Tonkin.
AFN News and Sports Roundup, a summary of developments from the wires of the AP and UPI. First, the news.
Good afternoon, this is Bob Andresen in Frankfurt. The spacecraft continues on course to the moon. Trouble developed temporarily with the guidance and navigation system in the command ship today, locking the vehicle in a single position. Astronaut Thomas Mattingly, with help from Mission Control, overcame the problem, but its source remains a mystery. There was no danger to the astronauts, and the ship has a backup guidance system that could get them home safely. But if the primary guidance system were out of action, the moon landing would have had to have been canceled.
It's 4 o'clock in Central Europe. 3 American aircraft reported shot down in South Vietnam.
AFN News from the wires of the AP and UPI.
Good afternoon. This is John Wood, AFN News reporting. The Houston Space Center are studying data from the Apollo 16 moon flight. They are trying to learn what caused the temporary guidance problem aboard the command ship. It had locked the vehicle in one position for a short time. Astronaut Thomas Mattingly, with help from Mission Control, quickly overcame the trouble. The source of the problem remains a mystery. Backup guidance systems could have returned the astronauts to Earth, but the moon landing would have been canceled due to any primary navigational failure.
It's 6 o'clock in Central Europe. Denial of rumors of a limitation on American bombing of North Vietnam. A mysterious guidance problem aboard Apollo 16, and a disastrous plane crash in Ethiopia.
The 6 o'clock report, an expanded summary of world developments with Today in Europe, compiled from the wires of the AP and UPI, including reports from the major American networks.
Good evening. I'm David Minot in Frankfurt. Navigation unit went afoul on America's Apollo 16 spacecraft today, and while the trouble sense has been corrected, the cause of the problem remains unknown. The malfunction is causing concern among Apollo ground controllers, who say the astronauts are in no danger, but that they don't know what effect, if any, the problem will have on plans to land on and explore the lunar surface. CBS newsman Del Vaughn, quoting space officials, says there is a backup navigational system on board the craft, but that it can be used only for returning to Earth and not for a lunar landing.
It was almost bedtime for the astronauts. The routine check of the lunar lander had been completed, and astronaut Ken Mattingly was maneuvering the ship to take star sightings. A warning light came on. Mattingly relayed word to Houston Control.
Yeah, I'm not sure what just happened. I just saw, I'm looking at the optics, and all of a sudden I saw a warning light, and I got a no attitude and a gimbal lock light. And seems, in fact, looks like the platform may be frozen.
The gimbals assure the spacecraft maintains a proper position. Without them, the astronauts could not control the craft's attitude. That paint flecking off the capsule will not rule out a lunar landing, but debris from the flecking is obscuring the optic system. Sightings on large objects are being used to determine how serious the navigation problems may be. If this primary navigation system goes out, the moon landing would be canceled. A backup system would be used for a safe return to Earth. Del Vaughn at the CBS News Space Headquarters in New York.
It's 9 o'clock in Central Europe. The White House says Defense Secretary Laird states the official American position when he says the bombing of the North has not been suspended.
AFN News from the wires of the AP and UPI.
Good evening. This is John Wood, AFN News reporting. Astronauts overcame troubles with their guidance system and a radio antenna today and soared on toward the moon. The guidance difficulty was caused by an unexplained electrical field. It temporarily locked the spaceship in one position for 45 minutes earlier today, but it was overcome by troubleshooting in Mission Control and by the astronauts. And weakened an hour early to deal with the antenna problem, which at times blocked radio communications between Earth and Apollo 16. This was quickly corrected by resetting a series of switches in the command ship. None pose any threat to the astronauts or to the mission as Apollo 16 hurtles closer to its target. The craft is now about 190,000 miles from Earth and some 50,000 miles from the moon.
It's 10 o'clock in Central Europe. Defense Secretary Laird says the bombing of the North is continuing no matter what the reliable sources in Saigon are saying. The White House backs Laird up. Apollo 16 overcomes technical difficulties and streaks for the moon. White House aide Peter Flanagan agrees conditionally to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee, and Northern Ireland Catholics bury a slain leader.
The 10 o'clock report, an expanded summary of world developments compiled from the wires of the AP and UPI, with reports from the major American networks and comment.
Good evening. This is John Schell, AFN News reporting. Astronauts overcame troubles with their guidance system and a radio antenna today and soared on toward tomorrow's rendezvous with the moon. A guidance difficulty caused by an unexpected electrical field temporarily locked the spaceship in one position for 45 minutes, but it was taken care of by troubleshooting by the astronauts themselves and the engineers in Houston's Mission Control, who also took care of the antenna problem. They were the third and fourth problems to confront John Young, Charles Duke, and Thomas Mattingly on their two-day-old journey to the moon's mountainous highlands. None, however, posed any serious threat to the astronauts nor to the mission as Apollo 16 hurtles closer to its target. The spacecraft, now more than 200,000 miles from Earth, less than 50,000 miles from the moon.
It's 7 o'clock in Central Europe. Continued debate over U.S.-Vietnam policy as battle action continues. Apollo 16 still on target and on schedule. Gunfire echoes through Northern Ireland again.
The 7 o'clock report, an expanded summary of world developments compiled from the wires of the AP and UPI, with reports from the major American networks, sports, and stock market activity.
Good morning, this is Milt Fullerton in Frankfurt. Mean time now is 4 minutes, 15 seconds past 7. The Apollo 16 astronauts are in the middle of an 8-hour sleep period on this, the final day of their journey to the moon. The craft will be picking up speed during the day as it moves deeper within the moon's gravity field. Lunar orbit is to be achieved around 9:30 p.m. today, Central European time, with astronauts John Young and Charles Duke planning to set down on the moon tomorrow. They and crewmate Tom Mattingly wrestled with and solved some more in-flight problems yesterday, again easing fears that the moon landing would have to be scrapped. The troubles involved a guidance system locking in place and a faulty radio antenna. The spacemen are scheduled to wake up for breakfast shortly before 1 p.m. today, again Central European time. Communist forces overrun another South Vietnamese base, and the U.S. command discloses that the guided missile frigate Warden was hit and damaged by American planes, not by a North Vietnamese gunboat.
AFN News and Sports Roundup, a summary of developments from the wires of the AP and UPI. First, the news.
Good afternoon. I'm David Minot in Frankfurt. North Vietnamese astronauts scheduled to awaken for a big day ahead of them in less than an hour have swept into the grasp of lunar gravity. Today is the day they will insert themselves into moon orbit at about 10 o'clock tonight, Central European time. AFN plans to begin live coverage of that event at 10 minutes before 10 tonight. Then tomorrow, 2 of the astronauts are to board their lunar lander, Orion, and guide it to a landing on a mountain-ringed plateau in the moon's southern highlands. All systems are reported functioning smoothly at the moment, following such problems as flaking paint, a locked guidance system, plumbing difficulties, a bulky docking latch, and a faulty radio antenna.
Central European time is 4 o'clock. A British court of inquiry rules on the bloody Sunday killings in Northern Ireland. 16 spacecraft is hurtling toward a scheduled insertion into lunar orbit tonight. The vehicle is reported to be running soundly, about 20,000 miles from the moon. Astronauts John Young, Charles Duke, and Thomas Mattingly have been awakened after a sleep period. The spacemen will fire their rocket engine to put the craft into orbit after looping behind the moon's far side. That lunar orbit insertion will be broadcast live by AFN News at 10 minutes before 10 o'clock tonight.
Astronauts are awake now and have begun a day's work which will take them into moon orbit. Details from the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, Texas, and CBS correspondent Steve Young.
The Apollo astronauts seem to be excited this morning about their journey to the moon, for though they went to bed almost 2 hours late, they got up about 1 hour early. Breaking the silence, Commander John Young put in the first radio transmission of the day to Mission Control. Excitement is a relative thing, though, and this crew still remains rather quiet. With breakfast behind them, there are scientific experiments ahead for the astronauts, and in the late morning, the door to the scientific instrument module, the sim bay on the service module, will be blown away with an explosive charge, revealing some moon tracking cameras. A few minutes past 3 p.m. Eastern Time, Apollo 16 will duck behind the moon for the first time, where it's scheduled a few minutes later to fire its service propulsion engine. It will reappear around the other side of the moon 35 minutes later, and if all has gone well, the astronauts then will be in lunar orbit. Steve Young, CBS News, Manned Spacecraft Center, Houston.
Central European time is 9 o'clock. The U.S. Command reports an air and sea battle in the Gulf of Tonkin.
AFN News from the wires of the AP and UPI.
Good evening, Gary Baltell reporting.
Men of Apollo 16, the race toward the moon ends today when they swing around behind it this afternoon and emerge in lunar orbit. Astronaut Ken Mattingly will continue to circle the moon inside the command ship Casper for 6 days. Astronauts John Young and Charles Duke will go aboard the lunar module Orion and land on the moon tomorrow to begin 3 days of exploring the lunar highlands, the 9th and 10th Americans to walk the surface of the moon. Young and Duke inspected the LEM again last night, found everything in good shape. One minor problem, had trouble getting into his moon suit. A little had to be zipped up by his crewmates. Geologists on the ground get something to study this afternoon. The tumbling used-up third-stage booster rocket used to push the astronauts into their lunar flight path will crash into the moon at nearly 6,000 miles an hour, creating a moonquake. Scientists will be watching signals from instruments left at 3 earlier moon landing sites. Peter Hackus at the NBC News Apollo Space Center.
AFN will broadcast live coverage of the Apollo 16 Lunar Orbit Insertion at 9:50 this evening, or in about 47 minutes.
At this time, AFN News resumes its live coverage of the flight of Apollo 16. The Apollo 16 spacecraft slipped behind the backside of the moon, and the astronauts are preparing to fire into lunar orbit. The crew and equipment are ready for man's 5th attempt to land on the surface of the moon tomorrow. In just a moment, we'll be joining ABC News for live coverage of the Lunar Orbit Insertion of Apollo 16. And now to ABC.
Top news and brief from American Contemporary Radio. I'm Del Wade in New York. The Apollo 16 astronauts have just come around the moon, confirming the spaceship has gone into orbit. The U.S. command says North Vietnamese MiG fighter planes and patrol boats attacked U.S. destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin today, about 30 miles north of the DMZ. Reports say 1 U.S. destroyer hit, 4 sailors wounded. Secretary of State Rogers says the U.S. is not playing up the idea that Russia is supplying weapons to North Vietnam. But on Capitol Hill, Senator Barry Goldwater says
they're supplying 85% of the weapons and materials for the North Vietnamese to fight our men and the South Vietnamese. And I couldn't care less what the Soviets think. I don't give a damn what it does to a summit meeting.
And Goldwater says President Kennedy should have sent B-52s to bomb Haiphong early in the war.
We'll have more coverage of the flight of Apollo 16 in just a moment. The Apollo 16 astronauts earlier blasted away a panel which covered the spaceship's service module's mapping sensors, their last major maneuver before breaking into lunar orbit. They detonated a string of explosions to send that covering panel floating away into space 13,000 miles above the moon. The panel had covered the module's orbital reconnaissance instruments, which are vital to the moon mission. During the landing on the moon, the mothership will still be in orbit around the surface of the moon, and it has instruments aboard to map the lunar surface and provide cartographers back on the Earth with material with which they can make very exact measurements of certain significant features on the moon's surface. The Apollo 16 astronauts awoke about 1 hour early today without being called and had breakfast to the sounds of country music before tackling a busy day's work. Astronauts John Young, Thomas Mattingly, and Charles Duke were dead on course for their scheduled moon orbit, which they now have achieved. All systems still are go for tomorrow's first manned landing in the mountains of the moon, despite a range of unexplained problems, including a faulty fruit can which left the astronauts with a face full of peaches. The astronauts were awakened twice in their previous rest period because of a brief failure in their navigation unit, and they woke up an hour early today. They had breakfast of mixed fruit, ham, cornflakes, and cocoa, while a tape recorder played country music. Young and Mattingly recounted for Mission Control the tale of the flying peaches. For breakfast Tuesday, the astronauts ate a can of peaches being tested for astronauts working in the future Skylab space station. Mattingly said when he opened the can, the peaches shot out at him. "When you open that can, you get them all at once," he said. "You'll be happy to know we shared our peaches with Casper. He ate as much as we did." Casper is the name of the Apollo 16 command spaceship, and the name was taken from a cartoon character, Casper the Friendly Ghost. Young added, "There's still a lot of peach on Casper's face." The astronauts had a busy day ahead of them. They had to jettison the door covering the scientific instruments for experiments stored in the service module, and after lunch, they began the maneuvers to break their spaceship into lunar orbit. We have received confirmation that the Apollo 16 has gone into orbit around the moon with a 6-minute, 15-second braking blast of the main rocket aboard their spaceship. That's the service propulsion engine. The maneuver lined up the spaceship for the scheduled first manned landing on the moon's mountains tomorrow. Even as the astronauts slept last night, the gravitational pull of the moon began drawing the spaceship toward it, and the spent Saturn V's third-stage rocket was tugged toward an explosive collision with the moon. Scientists back on the Earth will be studying their instruments. There are some passive and some active seismic instruments which were implanted on the surface of the moon during past Apollo landings, and they will be radioing back to Earth the vibrations of the moon when the Saturn V third stage slams into the moon. The astronauts made a final check of their moonship before going to bed. Mission Control said all systems aboard the lunar module were functioning perfectly. Ground controllers say there were no further anxieties over the brief failure of the spaceship's main navigation unit Tuesday. They said an electrical storm knocked out the computer, which gives instructions to the unit, but there was nothing wrong with the navigational unit itself. The astronauts were awakened in the middle of a rest period, and the unit went out for 18 minutes. That unit fixes the spaceship's position in the emptiness of space by star sightings. They have a backup unit, which they can use for a return to the Earth, but they could not use their backup unit for landing on the moon. If they had not been able to fix their guidance system, they would have been forced to scrub the moon landing and return to the Earth. In any event, Mattingly, through the cooperation between Mattingly and scientists back on Earth at the Houston Manned Spacecraft Center, he unlocked the unit and he refixed the spaceship's position with telescope sightings on the sun and the moon. Later, experts on the ground radioed to Mattingly information on how to prevent this problem from recurring and how to fix it if it does recur. The astronauts now are in lunar orbit and are beginning a 6-day scientific exploration of the moon. Crew and equipment are all set for that landing. They climaxed a 3-day, 240,000-mile outward journey by sweeping behind the dark side of the moon and firing their service propulsion engine to put them into orbit. 14 minutes after they went behind the moon, which occurred about 50 minutes ago, the command ship's engine fired for 6 minutes. The result was to break Apollo 16 by about 2,000 miles an hour and put it in an elliptical orbit ranging from about 65 to 195 miles above the surface of the moon. Other problems on the flight of the Apollo 16 included flaking paint, that locked guidance system, which we spoke about earlier, plumbing troubles, and a faulty radio antenna. But at the moment, the Apollo 16 spaceship is go, and they are in orbit around the moon. During the exploration of the moon, which is scheduled to begin tomorrow, American scientists want the Apollo 16 astronauts to take the moon's temperature. The scientists are said to be startled by seemingly feverish readings from the last lunar landing. And they hope the new data will help resolve conflicting evidence about the interior of the Earth's satellite. Information from past lunar experiments is in disagreement about how hot the moon's interior is and how much radioactivity remains from the moon's fiery creation more than 4.6 billion years ago. The problem was compounded by the sensitive thermometers Apollo 15 embedded in the lunar surface last August at the foot of the moon's Apennine Mountains. Readings radioed to Earth indicate the moon was radiating twice as much internal heat into space as had been expected. The lunar heat flow is roughly 1/2 that of the Earth. If correct, this means the moon, which is only 1/6 as large as the Earth, has a molten interior and is much hotter than most authorities believe. Other figures, however, such as measurements of the moon's magnetic field, indicate the moon's interior now is relatively cold, about 1,000 degrees centigrade. And data from instruments aboard the Apollo 15 command ship that orbited the moon during the lunar exploration further complicate the picture. These instruments indicate the northeast quadrant of the moon's front side has high levels of radioactivity compared with the rest of the moon, where the levels are low. Experts speculate heat from decay of radioactive isotopes at the Apollo 15 site could be responsible for the high heat, low reading, a reading unrepresentative of the entire moon. Precisely pinpointing the heat and radioactivity remaining in the lunar interior is critical to scientists trying to unravel both the early history of the moon and the Earth. As reported, the Apollo 16 is in orbit around